We are in an unprecedented era where technology has vastly outpaced the ability of the public to recognize deep fakes, and even more so, lapped lawmakers, many of whom frankly seem unable to manage their email. Take, for example, what you're watching right now. I'm actually not Jake. I'm a deep fake Jake, a deep Jake, if you will, created by comedian Danny Polishuk, who has only been using AI for 2 weeks.
Google Labs reached out and said, listen, because of these new language models, we have an opportunity now to create a new generation of tools for thoughts. While there is an AI, there's a language model built into Notebook LM, and almost everything you do with the software is in some way working with this language model.
No, I think it's pretty extraordinary in the sense that it can start to understand that from a topics perspective, but it's also alarming for me personally in some respects, because there's no way that if you didn't know this was constructed in that way that you'd probably be able to tell that it wasn't two humans just talking about a topic. We talk a lot about the uncanny valley, right? Like a lot of the AI technology as it's been developing is never fooling anyone, but this seems to be one of the first latest pushes in the technology that advances beyond that. And I think that that's the point where we get a little bit concerned in terms of disclosure.
And welcome back to another episode of the 100-Year Podcast. My name is Adario Strange, and this week we have with us someone I would say who he's going to allow us to talk about something I've been thinking about for a long time. He's, I think, one of the best people to help us investigate this topic, which is AI and the news business. And we have with us today from Nota, Josh Brandow. How are you, Josh?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it. Love the show.
Thanks for being here.
Love what you're doing.
Thank you. And just so people kind of have a sense of like who you are, man, I just have to tell you, man, this is, I wanted to say this kind of offline, but I figured I'd just save it for the pod. There's just too much to talk about. Like we're going to try to limit it to under an hour, but we could do a 3-hour pod on what's happening in the news business with AI. There's just, so let me just set the stage a bit. Before I set the stage, let's tell people who you are. You previously were Chief Revenue Officer over at the Los Angeles Times, which again, that's another story. They're having their entire
that's 3 hours right there. If you want to do that.
I mean, just for those who don't know, we're still in. This is being recorded right before the election, and generally, newspapers give endorsements to candidates, and the new owner of the Los Angeles Times decided to stop endorsements. Then, along with that, I think shortly after that, Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, made the same decision with the Washington Post. And so now there's kind of like, aside from AI, now there's all this tumult in the news business about, billionaires and millionaires, kind of like controlling the news and tradition and that kind of thing. So this is just like a fraught time for news in general, aside from AI. But let's just kind of talk about your background a bit before I set the full stage. So Los Angeles Times, give us some like a sense of, I know you've been involved in the past with, I guess, advertising, kind of like the back end. Like, give us a sense of your news pedigree, your news business pedigree.
News business pedigree. So I initially started at Los Angeles Times and the San Diego Union Tribune. They were both purchased by Patrick Soon-Shiong, who is here in LA. Now that Elon's gone, I think probably the richest man in LA. He's a biotech guy. So he bought both those papers from the Tribune Company. He restructured a lot of the business based on the hope that we could apply new technologies to really keep, I think at the time, and maybe still, the fourth largest newspaper in America afloat, and really bridge the gap between antiquated ways in which you could gather news reporting to the future. I was part of that team that was brought in for that about 6 years ago at this point now. So we spent 4 years really trying to make it into functionally a modern company for news production, distribution, really try to figure out ways to meet, you and me on a very specific kind of plane. So not just rely on the print publication of the newspaper, but also, what are we doing digitally? What are we doing from a social perspective? How are we incorporating studio, elements to this, really making a far more dynamic way in which you could engage. So I oversaw a lot of the business side of that with my co-founder at this place that I've started about 2 years ago called Noda, which really, after 4 or 5 years, origin story style, we saw the opportunity to not only affect change at the Los Angeles Times and the San Diego Union Tribune, but really to affect change for the entire legacy media industry. So that's a broad term used to describe local market television stations, radio stations, newspapers, lifestyle publications, really anything that isn't born out of the next wave of technology and innovation from a social perspective or a newsletter perewspective.
Yeah,
and that's what we've been doing.
I looked at kind of what you've been up to maybe just prior to, starting Noda, and you went to University of Pennsylvania, UPenn, to engage in, I would say, like maybe just over a quarter long seminar and kind of, I guess, training boot camp on artificial intelligence in business. Can you tell me a bit about that? Because I find it interesting that UPenn was like involved in that.
Yeah. No one's asked me that question before. So I was looking at ways in which we could apply generative AI to a lot of the stuff that we were already building. So we were building in the last generation of technology when we started the company. So machine learning at a more basic level, not deep learning as it applies to, large language models as we know them today. So I spent a bit of time going back to one of my favorite places in the world, San Francisco, attending seminars, going to lectures, seeing what a lot of these companies were up to prior to the OpenAI release of ChatGPT. I also wanted to make sure that from a business case perspective, I understood the ramifications of generative AI as it was kind of coming to market. So went to Penn to understand the fundamentals of that, and if we could start applying that to our business use cases early on. So that was really helpful in that respect.
And give me, when was this? This is 2022?
2022, I think is right. Yeah. It's been a while.
Do you remember if it was late 2022, early, like when?
It was pretty late. I just returned from San Francisco where Scale AI had given a big presentation. And if you don't know what Scale AI is, I think they're a multi-unicorn billion dollar company now. And they effectively, and this is still very relevant to what we do and what everyone does at scale, but they're applying the human aspect to a lot of the machine learning. So what they do is at scale, they take humans to train the models for specific use cases for large corporations. And they were giving a presentation, and a bunch of heavy hitters kind of came in to talk about how they're seeing this develop in real time. So I thought, man, this makes sense. I should probably take some classes on this as well. And I think right after that conference, got COVID for the second or third time. So I was laid out and found the Penn course and started taking that. So that was probably September-ish of 2022.
I bring it up because we often discuss on this podcast that we're watching academia and kind of how they're dealing with AI, not just preparing students for the business world, but also the challenges of teaching while these students have AI, at their disposal. And so the idea that UPenn was, not necessarily early in the industry, but early in terms of mainstream awareness on that front is quite interesting to me. 2022 for me is a pivotal year. I feel like, at least my experience is that's when kind of like a lot of the research seemed to move, the generative AI research seemed to move from, I guess, the lab into the open source world, and then shortly thereafter into, I guess, commercially viable tools. And I remember at the time in 2022, I was at Quartz Media, the news org.
Yeah.
And and I, at the time, I was deeply engaged in using open source generative AI tools on my own, not with the Newsroom at all. And I hit a certain point, like kind of like almost an existential crisis moment where I thought, oh my God, this is, I could suddenly everything came together and I realized what was happening. And I, immediately rushed into the Newsroom, like the fabled Chicken Little, the sky's falling. We need to be aware of, what's coming. And I managed to actually set up a meeting with one of the engineers from OpenAI, and I actually had that engineer come into our newsroom and kind of give us like a private briefing of like generative AI, what it's capable of, what's happening. And since then, again, this is 2022, late 2022.
Yeah.
This is before most newsrooms had any real awareness of, I say most because we'll get to some of the early pioneers in AI news, but most newsrooms didn't really have much awareness of what was happening in AI. And since then, now I would say one of the primary roles, or one of the most high profile roles that you see in news, is head of AI initiatives or head of AI, strategy. Like this is kind of like a role. I want to touch on that as well. So that's kind of like setting the stage for those who are not news nerds. But I'm gonna when we actually publish this, I'm gonna send this out to as many news nerds as I know, so they can kind of get like maybe kind of like a primer education if they haven't been following. But just to kind of clarify for anyone who might dig into Nota and kind of look into your background and think, well, wait a minute, I see something here. What's going on? I want to clarify something that I think had wrong when I was researching you guys initially, which is the Sports Illustrated Arena Group relationship. Now, correct me if at any point if I have this wrong. My understanding is that you guys established some sort of partnership with them in 2023. Arena Group is the group that acquired Sports Illustrated. I think they no longer have ownership. I think that's in dispute. But they acquired ownership of Sports Illustrated. You guys secured a deal with them, but apparently they had also secured a deal with another company engaged in AI news generation. I could be wrong on that. You'll correct me shortly if I am wrong. But what happened was a big story came out last year accusing the publisher of Sports Illustrated of publishing fake, basically like literally fake news, like basically AI generated news using fake people, fake bylines. It was a big story, and it really disturbed a lot of people in the news industry. There were disputes from the Arena Group as to whether this or that was true. Now the ownership seems to have changed hands, so now there's even more muddied waters as to the future of Sports Illustrated. But I just want to make something clear. I don't really want to get too deep into that story. People can go read the larger story for themselves. But I just want to make it clear. Did you guys have some involvement in that story? Was it Advon? Do I have that name right?
Right. So I would love to just put a pin in a few things that you said. That's awesome at Quartz, by the way. Huge fan of Quartz from 2008, maybe. It's fantastic what was happening there. Just in terms of like presenting the news in a new way, I thought that was really powerful. So I'd love to get your perspective on how that all developed. That was really cool. The second thing that I'd love to touch back on is, as students go through what's now become just ever present from a Gen AI perspective, in their class structures, we're trying to work with them at journalism schools to show them the future of what's happening with a lot of these tools. We're trying to figure out how to work with ethicists and philosophers within the academic kind of organization structure, because I think a lot of them just view corporations as capitalists that are just chasing dollars and not really thinking about the broader implications of this technology as it relates to society at large. So that's a thing that we've been thinking a lot about and have a perspective on. And then from when we started with Sports Illustrated, they weren't our first clients. So they were with the Arena Group at the time. I believe that Arena Group had licensed the ability to use the brand. I think that was from Authentic Brands, I believe it is, that owns actual owns Sports Illustrated. We were just helping them with very simplistic AI generated editorial help. So it was all stuff that we still have today as part of our suite of tools, but functionally what we do is present you with a lot of SEO optimization possibilities that you could look at, edit, refresh, create on your own, things that were just very assistive in nature, but nothing that was creating any sort of tension within the newsroom or really trying to trick anyone in any way. They were working with a company called Advon at the same time. You're right about that. Advon was the one that was brought to light. I believe it was by 404 Media. They were doing an investigative piece at the time, and they came to the conclusion that some of the journalists that were representing the commerce section of Sports Illustrated, so selling products on behalf of Sports Illustrated, weren't probably real. They were using fake photos and fake bylines for those authors. That has not been proven, as far as I understand it. It's been disputed by them. And it was also a company that was working across a huge spectrum of media companies, really just presenting themselves as really trying to find cheaper labor effectively from a journalist perspective to do content commerce. I don't know what awareness any of them had in terms of that potentially being completely made up or falsified in terms of who those people were, either journalists or AI, but that was the kerfuffle around that. The same one happened, I think, at the same time around CNET. They had a similar problem in terms of using generative AI that was hallucinating quite a bit, allowing it to just kind of go rogue without oversight, is the narrative in the marketplace. I don't know how true that is either. I wasn't part of any of that. So yeah, just for a clarification perspective, like we had nothing to do with any of that at the time. And yeah, the whole nature of how that all came, new ownership, there's a big old mess happening.
So I'm glad you clarified that. I think it's right now, news meets technology is the Wild West. There's a big, and the storylines are so all over the place. I think it would be very easy for people to get confused. So I'm glad you cleared that up. And the CNET story was huge. I'm curious we're going to get deeper into Nota and the general industry, but to that particular question, what do you think about, because I remember when I started looking, this is back in 2022, I started just looking, okay, are there any AI generated books? Are there any blogs that are AI generated? Like what's going on? Like, has this already left the gate? Right. And I found a bunch. Now they weren't well done. They weren't, these didn't come from high profile, publishers. It was mostly kind of independent people experimenting. But even as early as 2022, early meaning mainstream awareness, in 2022, there were a bunch of AI generated books on Amazon, AI blogs that, if you didn't know what was in play, you might have thought, okay, well, these are just poorly written articles, but I'll try to, slog my way through it. What do you think about just the idea of creating a wholesale book or a wholesale, website, news website where it's completely AI generated? And maybe, and I'll put up maybe a pivot in there, AI generated, but not disclosed that it's AI generated, meaning they're kind of using, the idea that you think these are humans as kind of like a ruse to like draw you in and believe that this is a human team.
So, I mean, there's a ton to that. I think you make a good point in terms of what is the power of human generated news? What does it serve? What is the purpose of it? I think we could all agree that the demarcation between, AI generated anything and not disclosing that and AI generated assistive work is a pretty big one. I think that there is a lot of arguments out in the marketplace that would say that there's a lot of service journalism that can be done with AI that doesn't need a human. So a lot of the ways in which I think Google has been on record quite frequently over the last few years, pointing to sports scores in local communities where they didn't have a sports reporter left to cover that. It's pretty easy to take the data that's delivered to a newsroom and convert that. The same with weather. We've known that Bloomberg and others have been doing it with stocks for decades or over a decade, a very long time. Corporate earnings reports. There's a lot of consolidation of data that provides you with the summarization of things that I would argue is in service of the public good, because it's stuff that, frankly, you don't really need a human to do. It's not really adding more value to have. You could argue that there's nuance and there's a lot of wonderful editorial ways in which you could frame up a lot of those things. But if you don't have a person to do it, period, that's better than nothing. But I think when you get into things that are more investigative in nature, if you get into things that are more driven towards an impact that it would make in the broader community, that needs to be disclosed, and that shouldn't be something that is generated wholesale from an AI perspective, at least today.
Yeah, I want to just mention you talked about, for those unaware, AP, Associated Press, and Bloomberg are very early on AI. But you said decades. My understanding is that Bloomberg didn't start using AI to kind of craft earnings reports until around 2017, 2018. You're aware of something earlier than that, or were you kind of like mixing?
I thought it was earlier. I mean, they were using a lot of machine learning technology to just read the wires and corporate earnings reports and put together summarization from that in a very simplistic way. Right. Very early, I think. But it just really gets into the nature of what we mean when we even talk about artificial intelligence, right? So that's 3 hours right there at least.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of implications, ramifications of where this is going today. So we look at this technology every second of every day and how it applies to the future of journalism, the future of civic understanding and public good, and really try to stay as far away from that, crossing that Rubicon into generative anything. It's all assistive in every way. Nothing is published without a human editing it from our tool set. There's transmutation that happens, though. That's very interesting. So one of the ways in which we're struggling internally with this is, if I take a transcript from a radio broadcast or, a news segment on air, and I convert that using, let's say, a RAG structure for your archives. So, in simplistic terms, like I take data from your archives and I augment a transcript that wouldn't have all that data to help a journalist tell the story in a faster fashion. Is that generating something net new, or is that just augmenting something that's already existing? And I think that right now we'd argue that it's augmenting something that's already existing, and it's serving the public good in terms of providing it in a different format that people can engage with, that maybe didn't see that news segment or listen to that podcast, but read articles on a site, for example. But that's getting, even for us, we can see where that's going, right? So how much do you really need a human after you've trained it quite a bit? How close are these systems getting to mimicking the way in which we communicate with each other? I think Notebook LM with their new kind of audio feature is one of the ways in which I was pretty surprised and alarmed from a personal perspective in terms of how real it is.
Do this stuff. A couple of years ago, about a year and a half ago, some folks at Google Labs reached out and said, listen, because of these new language models, we have an opportunity now to create a new generation of tools for thoughts, the kind of software that you've been dreaming of your whole professional career, Stephen. And you should come and help us develop this from the beginning. So I came in and joined the team. We've created this thing called Notebook LM. And so while there is an AI, there's a language model built into Notebook LM, and almost everything you do with the software is in some way working with this language model. Everything that you do in conversation with that model is grounded in the documents you give it. So if you're a student and you've got your syllabus, you've got all your reading, you upload that reading to Notebook LM, and then the second you upload it, it's as if the AI has become an expert in that entire reading list. So whenever I ask something, it suggests 3 more questions based on what I've just been talking about with the model and on the content of my sources. So it gives me a good answer here. It summarizes a bunch of interesting things. It gives me 6 citations here. But then I can ask any question I want. So I could ask something like, surprising facts about ant colonies. And one of the things that's amazing about the models these days is that you can ask them for surprising information, that it has a concept of like what's surprising and what's not.
One of the ways in which they also provided a tool was called, what's it called? I don't remember the exact name of it, but you can drop it into an audio version of it, and it's 2 hosts, AI hosts.
Oh, that's the new product. Yeah, the AI podcast product. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it is effectively a podcast product. It was meant for, I think, an audio learning capability, but it's definitely as good as most podcasts. Representing as a male and a female podcast host talking about the subject matter without any human intervention. So you could just drop a PDF of something in and they'll talk to you about it for 15 minutes. The striking part of that is you don't have to do any sort of adjustments, and it's very, very natural in terms of how they not only speak to each other about the topics within whatever you've given them, but also how they find the points of tension, conflict, interest, and highlight those within their discussion with each other. That's the real big shift over, I think. The sophistication of the machine learning to be able to construct that in a way in which it understands the interest levels that potentially would be generated by human beings. No, I think it's pretty extraordinary in the sense that it can start to understand that from a topics perspective, but it's also alarming for me personally in some respects, because there's no way that if you didn't know this was constructed in that way, that you'd probably be able to tell that it wasn't two humans just talking about a topic. So we talk a lot about the uncanny valley, right? Like a lot of the AI technology as it's been developing is never fooling anyone or fooling a very few amount of people. So that seems to be almost a technological limitation that's a safety net for us in terms of, you know, even if it's not disclosed, you can kind of tell that it's synthetic in some respect. But this seems to be one of the first latest pushes in the technology that advances beyond that. It advances beyond our immediate understanding this is synthetic and it's not two human beings doing something. And I think that that's the point where we get a little bit concerned in terms of disclosure.
Yeah, so I looked at the product, and it kind of, what I think about it dovetails with a lot of what I think about this area in general, which is in 2022, when I began my, I guess, journey with, you know, really robust use of AI, I tried to figure out, okay, what's the place for a human journalist in the future, given these tools? Because, you know, AI software isn't static. So if it, you know, if you have kind of, well, it can't create, you know, good looking hands yet, you know, in terms of visuals. That's not, you know,
Right.
it was fascinating listening to artists, visual artists, traditional visual artists in 2022, you know, kind of almost bragging, well, you know, it'll never be able to do hands. So I'll, you know, and I'm thinking, do you understand the nature of software? It's iterative. These things improve. And I feel the same thing about, or the same way about generative AI text. And so, you know, I went through all of these machinations, you know, thinking about, you know, what the future might hold. And that's when it came to me. I said, okay, well, now the value proposition of a human journalist is their actual human meat space experience. What can they tell you that a machine can't tell you that is beyond pure information? What were their experiences walking out in the real world, working with other humans, touching and feeling our real world? These are only things that a machine, at least until there are, I guess, humanoid robots that are also imbued with these powers, which I guess is not that far off. But for the time being, these models cannot mimic, unless they lie, you know, the human experience. You know, if you're listening to one of those Google generated AI podcasts, and let's say someone dumped a research paper into the software, and now it's trying to kind of, you know, spit it out as a podcast of, you know, two people discussing this, you know, very, you know, niche topic. They can't talk about, you know, the lab or like in a real way in terms of what experiments took place. If they talk about arguments, they're only referring to arguments that have been published somewhere that the model used to train itself. They're not talking about real-time discussions between humans, or something that maybe I discussed on the phone with a professor, you know, a week ago. So there's still a huge amount of value beyond just the craft of journalism, you know, media itself, which I think, you know, there's still there. That's a whole other discussion. But just if we're just talking brass tacks,
Yeah. You're really just
because
coming up with huge themes we can talk about.
That's just gonna, because that could dovetail into super intelligence, and that's a whole other. But just brass tacks, like what we can, you know, if you are listening or watching us right now, what can an existing journalist or an aspiring journalist or media creator do? It is now time to. You are no longer able, in my opinion, to sit back behind your keyboard and hide behind the screen, and I will simply let my words speak for me. No, that's not good enough. We now need to know part of your value as a media creator and as a journalist, in my opinion, is now, who are you? We need to know who you are. What are your experiences? What do you bring beyond just the information? That's just my, I mean, do you agree, disagree with that? I mean, what do you think about that?
Wow. So I think you get to a really, there's many things. Like, I think that you're exactly right from an emotional standpoint. Machines have no emotions, but they're getting very good at mimicking. Even if we use that same example, they'll say like, you know, what really struck me, or I'm excited about this, or that's super interesting and I'd love to dig in more. So they're very good at doing that mimicry at this point. So even that is kind of getting to a place where it's hard for us to discern if it's a person feeling that feeling or if it's a mimic of that feeling that people would say from a syntactic, is that a word? No, a syntax kind of perspective. So that's one area that's concerning, I guess, also from that new technology breakthrough. What's really interesting is what I think you're saying is the differentiation is really on how a human can express to other humans how something contextually feels, how something contextually is related to other things that come from a lived experience. And that's the true value that we find in that. The tension between that, the tension with that is, it goes back to school again. So, a view from nowhere is what they've been taught to be trying to express in almost all journalism for decades and decades, where they're trying to be objective in their perspective and balance it. Now, you can argue that that's gone away over the last 20, 30 years, and that's part of the reason we're so divided as a country. There's a lot of, I think, merit to that, and I think no one would really dispute it. But where we're seeing a problem with that is, I mean, you could argue, or maybe you are arguing, that that's the inherent job of a journalist moving forward, that they need to be providing their own lived experience in terms of how they're communicating what's happening in the world around them through the story. But that's in direct conflict with a lot of the ways in which they've been trained, which they're supposed to be objective and straightforward, and offer some nuance, but nuance from a balanced point of view. So how we're going to solve for that to ensure that there's value being driven from human authored journalism in the future is something that has not been figured out yet, but I think is core to what needs to be decided.
Yeah, I'm so glad you hit on this, because a lot of people aren't aware of how many journalists, at least in the past, were trained. And it was almost like a priesthood of, you must be as objective as you can be, you are not to inject your own opinion, and to some degree, I think the ethic and the ideal is great, but it's an ideal. It's not true. Every human has bias. And unless you are just saint-like, your bias will slip into your reporting on some level. I remember, at least, in the beginning of my journalism career, I very much felt strongly about this objectivity idea. And whenever kind of like one of my colleagues did some sort of piece where it was kind of like one of those first person, pieces, like, and I opened the door and, and what I saw, all this, it kind of turned me off. I felt like, I can go read, Jack Kerouac or whatever. I can read, books, and essays for that kind of stuff. When I read kind of a magazine or a newspaper, at least this is like years ago, I just want, give me kind of just the facts, and you can pepper it with great craft, but I don't want to go further than that. But we are at a point where I think the people who are kind of like on this side of an issue or that side of an issue, I think at this point, that's kind of where at least human created media is going. You can't get, when you have tools like the Google tool you mentioned, that where the next frontier is, okay, I'm a human, here's what I think, and I think I just want to touch on one other thing you said. You talked about emotion. Well, that was really surprising, the model saying, things like that. It's a lie. And I think that's kind of the other key that I'm thinking about moving forward, is how okay we will be with lies in our media, in our news, in the content we consume. And will we stop thinking of them as lies? and we'll just think of them as a different kind of content. The idea of fake news, kind of came to, I guess, rise in the last decade, but this is really, fake. This is like, it's fake emotion, fake perspective. You can have a model basically scrape every essay in, the database of whatever various literature archives and come up with a very convincing fake of, a brand new experience of, walking through the meadow in New England and, touching, a flower and the butterfly, flew off my hand. And then I realized that writing is, blah, 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 blah. That's possible. Are the consumers, are we humans, are we okay with that lie? I think that's the next question we have to grapple with. I know we're getting into like, we could get into deep philosophy now.
Journalism, yeah. Man. I mean, I would argue that is the priesthood, as you called it, of objectivity is something that's only held by journalists and only put up against journalism when it's coming from a point of view that someone's not really comfortable with at this time. I think we've been gone from that in quite some time. And we even talk about what happened at the Los Angeles Times or the Wall Street Journal, or I think USA, a whole bunch of others have come out in the last 12 hours saying that they're not going to endorse a presidential candidate, for example. But that's also something that's been conflated for many years. The editorial side of, say a newspaper and the opinion side of the newspaper. And between those two is a firewall, supposedly, right? Where you can have opinion, as we've discussed, and then have that objective point of view. That's the idea between the two. And one is dictated probably by more of the business desires of the ownership of that organization. So they can direct the opinion side and say, like, this is what I believe. This is my, I own this. And I want to be involved in that aspect of how my beliefs are espoused through this mechanism of my, of Fox News or of the Los Angeles Times or whatever format of media. And I don't think people understand that. I don't think people have understood the differentiation between those two things in quite some time. So I think that's already been something that has been porous at best in terms of how people can take in, like, is this the facts, and this is what you're weighed those, and this is where we should go with a fact-based thing, or is this the truth rather? You've taken the facts and this is the truth, or have you taken the facts, left out some other facts, and this is just the perspective you're sharing? It's a really tricky place to be as a human being. It's certainly a really tricky place to be in terms of what value you are serving your community with in terms of journalism.
It's interesting. I read the Jeff Bezos statement, and just to be clear, I don't intend to get into politics here, but on the, I guess, business dynamics of his decision, I read his statement, and I have to be honest, like, in the main, I kind of agree with his perspective. I never really felt comfortable with a newspaper endorsing, or a magazine endorsing anyone. And so that never sat well with me ever. However, given what we're saying now, I'm kind of, this ideal that I guess Bezos and some others, I'm forgetting the Gannett, the owner of USA Today, as you mentioned, that they're trying to kind of do this thing where we are now trying our best to be objective. I think that kind of game is, that if you have humans involved who plan to discuss things happening in our world, I think that game is over. And now this, the priesthood, as we keep referring to it, I think that's kind of coming to its end. It's becoming, or has become, obsolete. So I think the intent by Jeff Bezos is probably on the right track. I don't know that it necessarily points to a real future, at least in terms of humans being involved in news. It's on that point, I want to kind of like call out the, I guess, dramatic change in the news industry that we've just seen in the last couple of years with regard to AI. There's this new trend, which I think is, the correct trend, of large newsrooms hiring people to become AI czars and lead the newsroom and investigate the tools and implement the tools. And some newsrooms have already had some of these people involved. So I'll just call out. So actually, former editor-in-chief, my colleague, Zach Seward, former editor of Quartz. He's now at New York Times, the New York Times as editorial director of AI initiatives. We now have Ernest Kung, who is the AI product manager at Associated Press. We have, and before Ernest, there was Lisa Gibbs and Francesco Marconi. Francesco Marconi was at the Wall Street Journal, also heading up AI efforts. At the Washington Post, you have Phoebe Connolly. I think her title is editor for AI strategy and innovation. And over at Reuters, you recently had Gina Chow. I'm not sure I'm saying the last name right, who was heading up innovation, which involved AI. But that person's now over at Semaphore. And at Bloomberg, I think the head of AI engineering now is Anju Kambador. And so this is like, and that's just kind of scratching the surface. I just mentioned like some of the biggest, most influential newsrooms, and that's just scratching the surface. This is now like a real role. It encourages me that places like, the University of Pennsylvania and other places, I'm sure the Craig Newmark School over at Columbia, I'm sure they're probably doing something. I'm sure Stanford's involved. It's encouraging that these, universities training journalism students are kind of getting ahead of the curve. And you mentioned earlier this idea of like what journalists are doing now in terms of using the tools. Otter.ai is, I would say, one of the biggest tools for like transcription. Now you have to, I think the problem with a lot of these generative AI tools is you can't be lazy. You can't be a lazy human, meaning you have to watch out for hallucinations. So you can't just dump your recorded interview into Otter and just hope, it got everything right. It could get, I've seen major mistakes from Otter, not frequently, but often enough that if you're not checking, if you're lazy, you could publish something that's very problematic. Are you seeing anything else like that? I mean, I know like Noda is essentially kind of competing in that space, but like, how are you seeing journalists embrace these tools? What are kind of, I guess, the pitfalls and the best case scenarios you've seen so far?
Yeah. So first I'd say, actually there's we're human beings. So the time horizon thing is something I think about a lot. So what is seen as off the table in terms of something that you'd be willing to think about, address, or utilize today could be in a year just adopted by everyone. And what we've seen over the last 2.5 years of our company taking shape is meeting with all of these editors in chiefs, all of these CTOs, all of these journalists across thousands of institutions. And it's evolved from fear and disbelief in the beginning to it's going to take, oh, this is real, this is going to take my job, to, hey, there's some possibilities that this could help accelerate stories that I'm trying to get out. I can do my job better, to let's create some tools internally. Let's control the way in which we test this out. And let's see if there's any value to it, to, oh, there's absolutely value to it. And by the way, everyone's using a version of this quietly, personally, to create some things. How do we control that from a security standpoint? How do we control that from a quality standpoint? How do we ensure that our data is housed in the right way, that it's not going in the wrong places? All the way to, great, we want to work with companies just like Noda in the space that have done a lot of that work for us, that are continuing to evolve this technology, but in ways in which we find immediate benefit in our organization, but also broadly in how we serve the people we're trying to serve. So it's been a wild few years in that regard. And throughout that entire process, and a parallel path or related to it very directly, has been the beginning of, an AI council that is constructed either from an association standpoint or from individual media operators to, hey, we should get some people that are very interested in this to start testing this. Hey, we should do some partnerships with some universities and labs, to this, what we're seeing, to your point, the AI czar. I think Lenfest and OpenAI and Microsoft just announced $20 million in funding to 5 very large newspapers across the US, where they're helping to fund those positions. to ensure that there is someone utilizing these tools. I mean, that's obviously in service of a lot of Microsoft and OpenAI as well. But if you step back from that process a little bit and see what's happened to news organizations over the last 25 years, it's really heartening to see an adoption of this technology by this group of people, however slowly, however skeptically, because, you know, with they were effectively the localized Googles of their day up until 18 years ago, 17 years ago. They all represented the warehouse of institutional and commercial knowledge in whatever city that they were prominent in. And that just was eroded by the Yahoos and the Googles and the AOLs, and then eroded by social media, eroded by mobile, eroded by video needs for a lot of them. And now we're on another wave where it's very clear that this will erode the ability for them to do their jobs in some respect if they don't get on top of this technology. And at the very least, I would argue, have the ability to create enough content to fight back against the tide of synthetic data that was being created by other actors in the space. There's a lot to it, but it's pretty exciting to see how it's evolving. I mean, 2 years is a long time in this space, but it's a very short amount of time for huge organizations like this to start adopting something.
You know, this also makes me think about, you talk about, I mean, you called it synthetic, I guess. I'll just say fake, false, social media news. And one thing, a phenomenon I'm seeing quite frequently on places like YouTube, Twitter X, other places, is a headline that is not necessarily true or poorly researched or is essentially a rumor. And this isn't necessarily directly related to AI, but what I'm seeing is, let's say YouTubers with a very large audience, let's say they have 2 million subscribers. And one of the big things that happens on YouTube is YouTubers, and I guess, you know, also TikTok, just reading headlines and then riffing off of that news. Okay, this happened, you know, in Arkansas, and a woman did this and a guy did that, and it happened, and there was a fire, and now there's a lawsuit. And then they just start riffing with their opinion on that, you know, sensational news. And it's not true. And they don't do that. And I saw, the reason this comes to mind is I saw one of the YouTubers I won't name the YouTuber, but a YouTuber I really admire did this simply because I think the story kind of played to his, you know, tastes. And he just read a fake story and did an hour-long podcast about this story that was completely untrue. And I guess I bring it up in this context because I think that AI, particularly with the hallucinations and the use by people who aren't necessarily trained journalists, it will, I think, to some degree, make things a bit messier. Maybe that's almost just like a public service announcement. I want to ask you about you kind of talk about the intersection between tech companies and news organizations. And I want to kind of get your reaction to a couple of recent stories. So in 2023, the New York Times sued OpenAI and Microsoft over training their models on their data. You know, a cynic or just a regular business person could say, well, that was really just a lawsuit trying to get a deal in place, trying to kind of set the terms for a future deal. And as we see moving forward since then, there have been a number of deals between news orgs and tech companies. Then let's see, in April of this year, 2024, a group of newspapers, I think, sued OpenAI, New York Daily News, Chicago Tribune, Orlando Sentinel, a few others.
Yeah.
And then just this month, in October, the Dow Jones, which is the parent company of Wall Street Journal and the New York Post, sued Perplexity AI for what they call illegal copying. Do you think these lawsuits are, I guess, rooted in ethics and, you know, kind of like a desire to build a firewall on their domain, or are these just legal mechanisms to strike deals with these AI companies because they know it's inevitable?
Ooh, what a thorny question. I think the Perplexity was a cease and desist. They have some time left before that actually becomes a lawsuit, right? Because that gets into something that's very So broadly, I would say the legal system is another mechanism by which you can have the conversation about something that's happening, right? So I think it's very valuable that these lawsuits should come to light, and they should be pushed out into the world, because that's a way in which we can frame what's happening with this new technology, how it's utilizing data, who has rights to it, what's copyright infringement, what's not, what's fair use, what's not, and then how ideally you could structure some sort of remuneration deal with that. Because where we're at again is a place that media companies have been in for many, many years in a row, where a technology comes to market, it needs the data from these media companies to make it work. Social media is the same way, and we can talk about how this is now really advancing with Perplexity and search. I mean, Meta just came out, with their desire to move into bigger deals. I think they just did one maybe with the AP, or was it Reuters? Just this week.
Reuters, yeah.
Reuters, so that they could, again, we go back to RAG structures. There's a lot of hope that I have for that, but it's really setting the marketplace with this new technology. If what's worked from a playbook perspective for all these tech companies, especially the super well-founded ones like we're discussing, that are, they're startups, but they have more money in the bank than any of the media companies at this point as a startup, is that they want to create a technology, but they don't want to pay for the underlying data that would support it. So their pitch is typically, hey, we're still developing this. We want to see where the market is for it. We'll figure out a way in which we can pay you for it in the future. But since we're just developing and testing in the market, we don't know what it looks like. So, just trust us and we'll figure it out down the road. And then down the road happens, and we know what happens with that. So I think that there's wisdom in terms of fool me once, maybe fool me 5 times, and this is the 6th, where that's finally coming to a place where everyone's like, hold on a second. It's not our responsibility as media companies that we're paying for these effectively. We're paying the hard costs for these stories to be created, for you to take them and try to develop a business model. That's not the responsibility of a different company to do. We live in a capitalist society. So, it's up to you to pay us for that. If that's what you want to be creating, no one's forcing you to do so. I think that's a pretty compelling argument there. But what it's also highlighting is maybe from an optimist perspective, a real revenue driver for media companies and a real role for journalists to provide direct revenue to organizations they work for and stay viable for the future. And that's reporting at the localized, state, national, international level, as it would serve any sort of what's going to happen with search products in the future. So fundamentally, when I'm searching for something that's happened in LA, unless Google or Anthropic or Meta has the data from today of what's been happening, or this hour or this minute available to it, and has the infrastructure to be able to support that, then that search product is terrible. Like, I don't want to use it because it's not helping me find the thing I'm looking for. So fundamentally, they need the data from a daily perspective, not just archival data from these media companies, to be relevant for their search products and other products moving forward in the future. So if that's true, and it seems to be true, and they're not going to go into the media business because it's a low margin business, it's very difficult, and there's a lot of other reasons why, then they need to establish pretty direct relationships with current media companies, and ones that probably can be developed for the future, so that they can feed into these search products that make them a lot of money from a technology standpoint. And that's very exciting, because that revenue stream has not existed in the past. And, we could argue that search products are some of the most valuable products that exist in the world. So if you're going to choose a technology by which you should be paid, that's a pretty good one to have to be paid for. And the other aspect of that from an ecosystem perspective means that there's hope from a direct line, if you're in journalism school, for what that would look like for you in the future, because your job may be even more sustainable due to the nature of how high quality journalism in a real-time basis is utilized with these technology companies. And there might be a direct line item within the budget of these media companies to pay for you to be doing that. So Metro reporters all of a sudden,
become
really
the rock stars. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Finally, if they get their turn.
Finally, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's the optimist's point of view, what we've seen historically, I would say, is the technology companies will try to find ways in which they don't have to pay for the infrastructure that supports their products as long as they possibly can, and then pay as little as they possibly can to make that happen. I mean, from a social and ethical perspective, that seems sad and a little bit wrong. From a civic engagement and a civic underpinning of what we believe in from a societal perspective, I think that's wrong. From a capitalist perspective, that's exactly the playbook that they should be utilizing. And they will always continue to do so because they have shareholders and that's what they care about. I think that the pitch back then to all of the media companies is to coalesce around the idea of this is a real marketplace, this is developing, and that they need to be setting the price for their own products in that marketplace as robustly as they possibly can and as quickly as they possibly can. Not in an occlusionary manner, obviously, because there's a lot of issues with that, but they certainly should be thinking about how to value their own content for this new framework for the future.
You know, I want to stay on that point, but you raised something about Metro reporters that made me think of something that I thought of maybe, I don't know, a month or two ago, which is there's an app called Citizen, which basically culls all of its information or most of its information from police scanners. So, you know, someone calls in 911, oh, someone's stealing something at, you know, the local pharmacy, you know, get the police down here. And if you subscribe to Citizen, you can hear the recording and you can hear all the details of, you know, what was said to the dispatch person on the 911 line. And then in Citizen, you also have a mechanism where users can kind of crowdsource information. So if you live near the incident, you can go out on the street, take video, or you can weigh in with details that you know. And when you were saying all this just now, I was just thinking, you know, this makes me think of a model I've been thinking, which is basically an AI model that would could maybe real time suck in that citizen data, which would, you know, kind of eliminate, I mean, I guess you need the time to train and, you know, inference and all that. But nevertheless, it's an idea that I think in the future could make things even more difficult for a Metro reporter. I think you were going to say something to that. No,
I mean, that's yeah, that depresses that that idea in terms of a direct revenue stream for Metro Report. I mean, you know, citizen journalism is absolutely valuable. It's very hard to get at scale, and what it's really, really hard to get, and we've seen through Citizen and Nextdoor and a whole bunch of other companies like that, is consistency, right? So people might engage with it in some respects, but also not at a consistent enough basis where you have a real high quality product there. But at scale, exactly, you can overcome inconsistency and potentially get to a place where, yeah, you could use that data to inform. I mean, Google obviously seeing a lot of value in terms of Reddit and the relationship there with their search products being exposed at the top of most searches that you do. That is arguably citizen opinion. And a lot of people are finding a lot of value in deeply researched subreddits on a topic that they're interested in, which I think that's probably pretty accurate. What we're also talking about there is the difference between a Metro reporter and one that's, you know, a section reporter, if it's a newspaper. So you're a generalist or you have an area of deep expertise, right? So how are we valuing those areas of deep expertise versus someone who's just very good at constructing a story in a format that people can engage with and understand?
Yeah, and agreed. And there's always the question in any technology and any innovation space, is good enough good enough? And often the answer, sadly, is yes. So you'll have, like, I'll just give you an example. I've been reporting on AR, VR for many years, and I've seen people kind of dib and dab, you know, kind of in the space and report something and get a lot of views. And I'll think, this is not well reported. I can tell you didn't wear the headset or you didn't try the smart glasses on, but people are just, you know, reading what you're putting out. So I think that's a great point. I also want to talk about that really quickly. The Google thing you mentioned. I'm actually with the example I gave you about YouTubers. I'm also seeing now when they're discussing a topic and they say, well, let me put that in Google. Let me ask Google real quick. And then they get that AI, the new AI response.
Yeah.
And they're reading that AI response as though that's the research, that's the truth, That's enough. So it's really disturbing. But it seems like, I guess, for their subscribers, it's good enough. There, no research necessary as long as you're entertaining me, I guess, on some level. I want to just, kind of, I guess, to begin to wrap up, talk about business models. When I research stories for this podcast, I go all over the place, every place, like technical, websites like Spectrum, MIT, medical research papers, all the way down to, a New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, whatever. And what I'm finding now is it's almost impossible to really do a news search the way I used to without constantly getting hit with pop-ups that block what I'm trying to read. And the most I can see, this is a weird new trend. They'll let you see the headline, but now you can't even see the subheadline in many cases. The pop-up blocks everything but the very top of the headline. And so, even, someone doing well for themselves, you can't subscribe to everyone. You can't, subscribe to every news source. And so I'm just wondering, looking at this new model of, I guess, pairing with news orgs, pairing with tech companies, big tech companies, and I guess getting some sort of, I don't know, I guess the model I would refer to would be like BMI, ASCAP, music publishers, where you get like tiny little payments, every time your music is played, that kind of, on the radio, that kind of thing. I mean, do you think that's like a viable future versus in what I believe is kind of a not viable situation where you're asking pretty much everyone to subscribe to 100 different websites and pay for it, and they can't subscribe. Your average person might subscribe to 2 or 3.
These questions are dense. So I mean,
tell us our future here, sir.
Yeah, I mean, I thought a lot about that, obviously, at the Los Angeles Times and San Diego Union Tribune in terms of subscriber growth and what's the value of keeping a story behind a paywall versus not. How do you find other monetization mechanisms that show value, but also support, the hundreds of journalists that you have on staff that need to tell the story of the world around them. But I think if you start with what people in these organizations are dealing with, what they're dealing with is companies constructed to create one thing, and they've been just ruthlessly trying to figure out ways in which they can get better and better at that one thing. And that's an article or news at 5 or the radio broadcast in the morning or whatever, what have you. And they're pretty bad at creating almost everything else. So the infrastructure in these places is all conceived of, the staffing structure, monetization structures go along with that to be as optimized as possible to create a digital or physical newspaper, let's say that. And what you need to do to break out of that is show value without having to deconstruct the whole model. So if you can find a way to create a framework or lattice work, whatever you want to call it, around that optimization for that one asset, be it a digital article or whatever, then you can show success very quickly in terms of how you can monetize a new aspect of the same workflow. So if you can transmute, for example, that article or translate it very easily into a video, then all of a sudden you have the dream that all these companies have pursued every few years when YouTube says, like, we need more video and we'll pay you a CPM that's 20x what you get from an article perspective. So the ad model would support that and everyone's happy. The problem has always been that this other mechanism of media is something that they're not optimized for and they can't really support at scale because it's just too much money that needs to go into it. Where we're going with Gen AI is the ability to do that at scale across all mediums extraordinarily cheaply. And where we're really going to going when we're talking about predictive AI, because that's a whole other area we can talk about in the future, we can know not only that you have a whole routine in the morning, but you prefer to read something when you wake up in bed on your phone, and then you want to get up, put in your headphones and walk the dog and continue that story. And then we want a related story served to you on the drive, on another podcast or another mechanism by which you want to engage with it, so on and so forth. So you can really get to a nuanced, hyper-specific way in which the value that has been creating is unlocked from all of these companies, because it's really just it's stuck in one kind of mechanism or one medium, and it's very difficult for them to even do experiments to get out of that medium to see the value of others, and that's what AI affords. So I think that that's an esoteric answer to your question, but it's such a complex problem that's the best way I can frame it.
And I want to wrap up here, but just tell me, just casually, and again, away from any of your business relationships, partnerships, deals in play, who are you a fan of in terms of traditional news orgs, or even new startups? You mentioned 404, which I would say that's not necessarily citizen media because they came from Vice, so they're experienced. But there are still startups, happening in the news business. Who, which one that's maybe using the tools natively, the AI tools natively, are you a fan of, just casually?
Casually a fan of. I am a fan of 404 because they just seem to surface a lot of stuff that's well investigated that I really enjoy.
No, but I mean, do they use AI? Because I'm thinking primarily news orgs that are using AI, like in ways that are kind of seamless.
Yeah, I mean, I'd argue that we have hundreds of customers using our AI tools, but they're not surfacing a lot of stuff that you would see. It's a lot of back-end efficiencies that we construct with them. So pre-publication for editorial teams is where our value lies there. From a post-publication perspective, I'd say that anyone utilizing AI tools to just get more video out across social channels has been really valuable. Actually, when we first started working with Sports Illustrated, to go back to the very early example of the company, we were able to take articles and create videos out of them for them, very simple card-based videos, but in 20 seconds. And I used to beg my studios team to create videos for all the articles, especially for investigative pieces, that I wouldn't know about right until they were published on our site. And I'm like scrambling around trying to find ways in which we could tell that story. So now we can do it. We can do it in seconds. And we saw the same thing that I think you mentioned earlier also, like while not as high of a quality, the engagement levels, the click-throughs, all of those things were equivalent to the higher quality stuff. So I think, I don't want to get off track to answer your question, but functionally, we also need to talk about what people actually want versus what people think in the media industry that they need. And want versus need is always going to, err on the side of want. And that's where the whole industry has been suffering for so many years. It's like, no one's going to eat their vegetables. They just want a quick hit of dopamine, want to find out about that thing in the summarization, like the YouTuber, right? And then move to the next thing. I mean, we're seeing some anecdotal evidence that that's not necessarily the case all the time, but it is the case most of the time, I'd say. So any organizational structure that is doing a good job of taking their core product in whatever capacity or medium that is and pushing it out across a lot of other mediums I'd be a fan of broadly.
Great. And I'll let you go. I'm hitting you with all these big questions, trying to get you to solve all problems for the news industry. But
this is fun. These are great questions.
I mean, I love this conversation, but in summary, like, let's say there's a news professional, a veteran, or kind of a newbie, someone, just starting out. What's your general perspective of the news business moving forward with AI? Just in general, how do you sum everything up in terms of the next, let's say, 5 years?
Pursue your areas of focus that interest you outside of I think that like your lived experience is going to become more influential in your work as you move forward, much more so than we've had in the past. So if you're really into any sort of, hobby, interest, world affair, whatever that is, pursue that as much as you pursue the ability to tell a story, because I think the construction of the inverted pyramid is going away. If it hasn't already, it should. Tell the story in the medium that you're most comfortable in, knowing that you can now use this technology to convert that medium into any other medium. So just be the storyteller in your own voice in the way in which you're most comfortable to tell that story. And then I would also say that there's a lot of hope for you for the future that I did not have for you 3 years ago. I would have thought it's insane or a crime for you to, and I have a degree in philosophy, for example, for you to do that and pursue that career without real understanding of the mechanisms of commerce. But I think because we're developing into a society that is going to really value the underpinning story and the human perspective on that story for the future, especially at these lauded newsrooms that you can trust that that's coming from a human being and they stuck to that path. That there's a pretty viable future for you if you do it right. So I don't know if you need to go to journalism school, but we're working with journalism schools now too to ensure that these tools are in the classroom so that you can learn them as you go out to your first jobs.
And everything you just said, do you say that in the context of a journalist working with AI, or because you never mentioned technology in what you just said?
Yeah, I would say that you're going to have to. I think that's already a given. There's no way in which you can succeed in any capacity without understanding what AI can do for you. I think, what I meant the whole time was like AI provides you the ability to tell your story in any format you want, and it will do the rest. So just be very good at telling a story with your lived experience in the format that you're most comfortable in, and AI will take care of everything else from a distribution perspective. But it should never get to a place where it can replace you and your area of expertise. So just focus on that.
Awesome. And remind us, the URL is heynota.com.
Yeah, you'll know we make it big if we get nota.com, because I think that's $1 bazillion to buy. So it's heynota.com.
By the way, I might even edit this out, but I'm just curious. There's a South Korean company called Nota as well.
There is.
What are you guys doing? Yeah. Like, what can you do anything
Let's
to
talk about it? Nota AI, autonomous driving, I think, is what they're into. So hopefully it's differentiated enough that you know that you're at the wrong site if you go to that one. And then we really liked it because Nota is note in Latin, but it also means none of the above, which is what we really want to stand for as a company. So I just can't walk away. It's just too good of a name.
So it's Hey, H-E-Y, Nota, Nota.com.
That's right.
All right. Josh Brandau, I thank you for joining us. This has been great. We should do a part 2. Let's let maybe like a few more big news events happen in the industry, and then maybe we can do like a round 2, because this is like we're cutting this short. For those watching and listening, we're cutting this short. There's a lot more to discuss, but I can't keep them here forever. So Josh, thanks again for joining us.
I had a wonderful time, and I'd love to do a part 2, part 3, part 4. I think awesome. We could talk about this for forever. It's been great. Thank you so much.
Awesome. And we will see you guys next time.